Are we witnessing the final collapse of Middle Eastern diplomacy, or just the opening salvo of a much darker, wider war? A ceasefire celebrated at sunset, shattered by 160 bombs before the next dusk. Welcome to the Mercer Global Brief. Today, we unpack the 24-hour illusion that just set the world's most volatile region on fire. On the evening of April 7th, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief as a 2-week ceasefire between Washington and Tehran was announced, contingent on the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Global markets responded instantly, with Wall Street traders temporarily relieved from the fear of surging oil prices. For a fleeting moment, the flames consuming the Middle East appeared to be smothered. But did anyone truly believe the ink on that agreement was dry? In this region, diplomacy is often just a thin sheet of ice over a boiling ocean. Less than 24 hours later, that ice shattered. On the afternoon of April 8th, the skies over Beirut were torn apart. The Israeli Air Force launched a massive, unannounced military operation, ominously codenamed Eternal Darkness. 50 advanced fighter jets, a lethal, highly coordinated mix of F-15 Strike Eagles and F-35 stealth fighters, descended upon the Lebanese capital. In a concentrated 10-minute window, they unleashed 160 precision-guided munitions, obliterating over 100 targets in the southern suburbs of Beirut. The sheer logistics of this assault tell the real story. You do not mobilize 50 advanced aircraft and calculate 160 strike vectors in a matter of hours. This level of lethality requires weeks of planning. It violently echoes the chilling precision of the 1982 Lebanon War, when Israel launched a lightning-fast invasion to dismantle militant infrastructure, catching the world entirely off guard. The devastation was catastrophic. Official numbers initially cited 89 dead and 722 injured. But within a single day, as the dust settled over the rubble, the death toll surged to 254, with casualties skyrocketing past 1,165. Among them were countless civilians, the elderly and children, buried beneath the concrete of their own homes. A ceasefire was promised to the world, yet the people of Lebanon were handed a slaughter. Because in the grand theater of geopolitics, the promises of empires are merely the background music to the marching of armies. How does the world's most powerful nation sign a peace treaty on Monday and bless a bombing run on Tuesday? The answer is not simply hypocrisy. It is a terrifyingly calculated strategy. On the exact same day, Israeli jets were turning Beirut into ash. Washington's message was delivered with chilling clarity. In a televised interview, Donald Trump explicitly stated that the 2-week ceasefire did not cover Lebanon or Hezbollah. Let that sink in. Just hours prior, Pakistan's Prime Minister, acting as a key diplomatic broker, assured the globe that the truce was comprehensive. Even the 10-point peace plan drafted by Tehran and initially acknowledged by American negotiators explicitly demanded a halt to military strikes on all fronts, including Lebanon. But the moment the ink dried, Washington invoked a brutal double standard. This is the geopolitical equivalent of a referee blowing the whistle for a timeout, only to secretly slip brass knuckles to one of the fighters. Why play such a dangerous and contradictory game? To understand this, you must follow the money, and more importantly, follow the votes. We are looking at a U.S. administration drowning in an election-year economic crisis, with domestic gasoline prices breaching the $4 a gallon mark for the first time in 4 years, and diesel, the absolute lifeblood of American logistics and agriculture, edging perilously close to $5.8. Inflation is acting as a political guillotine. For the White House, securing this ceasefire was never about humanitarian peace in the Middle East. It was a desperate maneuver to cool global oil markets, lower the consumer price index, and salvage collapsing poll numbers. Yet, the U.S. establishment still harbors a deep-rooted desire to bleed Iran's axis of resistance. What we are witnessing is a classic Cold War playbook rebooted for the 21st century. Think back to the 1980s, when superpowers funded and armed proxy forces from Central America to Afghanistan, maintaining plausible deniability while ruthlessly pursuing strategic dominance. Today, Washington is attempting the exact same tightrope walk, freezing the oil crisis with a public ceasefire, while quietly outsourcing the dirty work to Israel to dismantle Hezbollah's infrastructure. They want the political credit for peace, alongside the strategic dividends of war. But history shows us that you cannot hold an olive branch in one hand while green-lighting a 160-bomb airstrike with the other. In the ruthless casino of global hegemony, Washington always gambles with house money, but it is the people of the Middle East who inevitably pay the ultimate price. If you want to bring the global economy to its knees, you do not need a massive army. You just need to close one specific door, and Tehran just slammed it shut. Following the devastating strikes on Lebanon, Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, stepped up to the microphone. He did not just condemn Washington's blatant betrayal of the ceasefire terms. He outlined a brutal and immediate retaliation. True to their warning, Iran reversed course without a second of hesitation, slamming the gates of the Strait of Hormuz completely shut. Just hours earlier, as a gesture of good faith under the new truce, they had allowed 2 oil tankers to pass. Now, the corridor is a dead zone. Let us put this into terrifying perspective. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a Middle Eastern waterway. It is the jugular vein of global capitalism. We are talking about a geographical bottleneck, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which 21 million barrels of oil flow every single day. That is roughly 20% of the world's entire liquid petroleum supply. If you crunch the numbers, a total blockade freezes nearly $1.6 billion worth of energy shipments every 24 hours. The financial hemorrhage to the global supply chain is instantaneous. The international markets immediately felt the panic. Brent crude skyrocketed by over 4% in a matter of hours, crossing the $98 mark. Wall Street heavyweights like Goldman Sachs are already flashing red, warning that if this chokehold lasts even a month, we are staring down the barrel of $100 to $120 oil. To combat this, the U.S. desperately announced a release of 170 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But frankly, that is like trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. Meanwhile, panicked Asian buyers are drastically altering global shipping routes, sending a historic number of empty supertankers, over 68 vessels, double the usual average, racing toward American ports to secure alternative energy sources. This is the undeniable reality of modern asymmetric warfare. You do not defeat a superpower by matching its air force. You defeat it by strangling its supply chains. Why would America's closest ally deliberately sabotage a ceasefire that Washington so desperately needed? To answer that, you have to look past the diplomatic handshakes and examine the brutal survival instincts of the men at the table. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu may smile for the cameras, but behind closed doors, their core interests have violently collided for the White House. The calculus is simple and transactional. Lower the price of crude oil, crush domestic inflation, and secure the upcoming election. But for the Israeli Prime Minister, the stakes are existential. Netanyahu is fighting for his absolute political life, with his domestic approval ratings hemorrhaging and his government coalition heavily dependent on hardline, right-wing factions. His grip on power relies entirely on his image as the uncompromising defender of the Jewish state. For him, freezing the conflict right now is not a victory. It is political suicide. This brings us to the core of the issue. Hezbollah. Let us be clear. This is not just a ragtag militia. It is the crown jewel of Iran's axis of resistance. It is a highly trained, deeply entrenched proxy force that effectively extends Tehran's military reach all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Armed with an estimated arsenal of over 150,000 rockets pointed directly at Israel's northern corridor, Hezbollah holds millions of Israeli citizens in a perpetual state of terror. For Israel, neutralizing this threat is an absolute zero-sum game. You simply cannot coexist with a loaded gun pressed perpetually against your temple. This is exactly why, just 2 days before the ceasefire was announced, Netanyahu reportedly made a tense back-channel call to Washington. The message was unambiguous: do not tie my hands in Lebanon. Israel then ruthlessly exploited a glaring loophole in the agreement. The pact technically prevented direct strikes between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. However, Israel conveniently argued that Hezbollah, as a Lebanese political and military entity, fell outside that protective umbrella. They used the cover of a global truce to execute a massive decapitation strike. For Washington, the ceasefire was a temporary fire extinguisher, but for Tel Aviv, it was a straitjacket they absolutely refused to wear. And herein lies the oldest, most ruthless law of political power. When a leader's domestic survival requires a war, peace suddenly becomes the most dangerous enemy in the room. While the West seems trapped in a cycle of arson and firefighting, a different kind of architecture is being quietly assembled in the East. As the smoke over Beirut thickened on April 8th, the diplomatic machinery in Beijing and Islamabad was already operating at full throttle. Consider the sheer scale of the effort. On that single day, China's foreign ministry confirmed that since the initial outbreak of this conflict, their top diplomats had engaged in no fewer than 26 high-level calls with foreign counterparts. Special envoys have been crisscrossing the region, not with threats of carrier strike groups, but with a 5-point peace initiative co-authored by China and Pakistan. Why does this matter? Because for decades, the Middle East was a chessboard where Western powers played a zero-sum game of containment. But the recent success of the China-brokered Saudi-Iran rapprochement has fundamentally shifted the gravitational center of regional diplomacy. Beijing's approach, what we might call developmental peace, is built on the premise that economic stability is the only permanent antidote to religious and territorial conflict. Pakistan's role here is equally critical. As the only nuclear-armed nation in the Islamic world, Islamabad possesses a unique cultural and religious bridge to both Tehran and the Gulf monarchies. By aligning with China's diplomatic weight, Pakistan provides the regional intimacy that Western negotiators have historically lacked. They are not just calling for a pause in the killing, they are proposing a structural reintegration of the Middle East into the global trade network. As we stand at this crossroads, the contrast is stark. One side offers a ceasefire that is really just a tactical pause to reload. The other offers a framework for long-term coexistence. Whether the world is ready to trade the old gunboat diplomacy for this new, multipolar architecture remains the defining question of our decade. In the end, peace is not merely the absence of war. It is the presence of an order where war no longer makes sense. And as the sun sets on a fractured Middle East, the world is watching to see which sun will rise tomorrow. Stay sharp. I am Daniel Mercer. This is the Global Brief.